The sentence wasn't death by hanging. In the dusty, sun-bleached plaza of Redemption Bluff, that would have been a mercy. Silas Cain, the man who owned the town in all but name, pronounced it himself, his voice dripping with false piety for the crowd. She wasn't to be given the quick finality of a rope. Instead, Josephine Bell, a bookkeeper's daughter from Boston, was to be given God's judgment. They would give her 1 canteen of water, a slice of hardtack, and point her east into the scorched moor of the Dragoon Mountains. They were sending her to Cascais, the ghost who hunts. They were sending her to a blood hunter, Apache, to die. The Arizona Territory in 1878 was a land of brutal truths, and Josephine Bell had learned the hardest of them all. The truth doesn't set you free. It gets you killed. It had all started so innocently. Her father, Thomas Bell, a man with a gentle soul and a mind for numbers, had been hired by the town's founder and patriarch, Silas Cain, to put his sprawling cattle empire's finances in order. For a year, life in Redemption Bluff had been a fragile peace, a welcome respite from the crowded, coal-dusted streets of Boston they'd fled after her mother's passing. Josephine, with her sharp mind and her father's tutelage, often assisted him. It was during one of these late-night sessions, cross-referencing Cain's land acquisition deeds with territorial survey maps, that she found the discrepancy. It was a faint, almost erased set of markings on an older map tucked away inside a heavy leather ledger. It detailed a spring, a vital water source, and the small plot around it belonging to the O'Malley family. But on Cain's official deed, that spring was located squarely in the middle of his own vast Bar K ranch. The O'Malleys, a family of 4, had simply vanished a year prior. The official story was they'd packed up and headed for California. Before her father could decide what to do, he was struck by a sudden violent fever and died within 2 days. The town doctor, a nervous man named Alistair Finch, who owed Cain a significant debt, called it cholera. Josephine knew better. Her father had been perfectly healthy. Grief-stricken and terrified, she hid the ledger. She knew with chilling certainty that her father hadn't died of cholera. He'd died of knowledge. Silas Cain was a predator who wore the mask of a benefactor. He'd built the church, paid the sheriff's salary, and offered credit at his general store. In return, he demanded absolute loyalty, and the town gave it too afraid to do otherwise. He was a broad-shouldered man with eyes as cold and grey as river stones. When he found out Josephine had been helping her father, he began to watch her. Her mistake was one of desperation. She tried to sell her father's small homestead to get enough money to flee to Santa Fe. When the potential buyer, a freighter named Gus, asked about the property lines, she foolishly mentioned her father's detailed records. The word got back to Cain within the hour. That evening, Sheriff Brody, a man whose spine was as malleable as warm wax, came to her door with 2 deputies. They didn't knock. They tore the small cabin apart. They found the ledger hidden beneath a loose floorboard. The trial was a spectacle. Held in the open with Cain standing beside the makeshift judge's table, it was over before it began. Cain presented his own doctored ledger, claiming Josephine had forged the one they found, attempting to blackmail him, and lay false claim to his land. He painted her as a conniving, dangerous woman from the East, full of city tricks and deceit. This woman, Cain bellowed his voice, echoing off the adobe walls, is a poison in our midst. She sought to undo the prosperity we have all built together. But we are a God-fearing people. We do not hang women in Redemption Bluff. A murmur of approval went through the crowd. We will let Providence decide her fate. He continued, a cruel smile touching his lips. We will send her into the badlands. If she is as innocent as she claims, surely God will protect her. He will shield her from the sun, the snakes, and from Casca. A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. Casca. The name was a curse, a ghost story told to frighten children. Only this ghost was real. A renegade Apache. They said he was the last of his band, a warrior so fierce his own people had cast him out. They called him the Blood Hunter, a name earned from the brutal, solitary vengeance he'd exacted upon the gold prospectors who had murdered his family years ago. To be sent into his territory was a death sentence, but one that allowed the people of Redemption Bluff to wash their hands of it. Josephine stood alone, her face pale with dust and fear. She looked at the faces in the crowd, people she had shared pleasantries with the baker, the blacksmith's wife, and saw only fear and averted eyes. They were accomplices in their silence. Sheriff Brody roughly tied her hands in front of her. He pushed the canteen into them and shoved the hardtack into her dress pocket. "East," he grunted, pointing. "Just walk east." As she took her first steps out of town, leaving the last vestiges of civilization, behind a final chilling whisper reached her ears, carried on the hot, dry wind. It was Silas Cain speaking to the sheriff. "Make sure no one follows. The coyotes and the Apache will do our work for us." The sun was a merciless hammer. Within an hour, the town of Redemption Bluff was a shimmering smudge on the horizon, soon swallowed entirely by the vast, indifferent expanse of the Arizona desert. Josephine's world shrank to the crunch of her worn boots on gravel, the rasp of her own breathing, and the ever-present oppressive weight of the heat. The landscape was a study in ochre rust and bleached bone. Saguaro cacti stood like silent, tormented sentinels, their arms raised to a sky of searing, cloudless blue. Lizards skittered from the path, their movements the only sign of life, besides the buzzards circling high overhead, patient and knowing. By midday, the single canteen of water was half empty. She rationed it in tiny, maddening sips that barely wet her tongue before evaporating. Her Boston sensibilities, her knowledge of literature and figures meant nothing here. This world had its own terrifying mathematics, the angle of the sun, the dwindling supply of water, the distance between patches of shade that offered no real relief. Panic was a cold knot in her stomach. The thought of Casca the Blood Hunter was a constant terror. Every shadow seemed to coalesce into the form of a man. The whisper of the wind through a thorny acacia sounded like a footfall. She was a city mouse, thrown into a den of wolves, and she knew it. But beneath the fear, a stubborn spark of her father's resilience flickered. Thomas Bell had not raised a daughter to give up. Survive first justice. Later she told herself the words a silent mantra against the rising tide of despair. The first day bled into a night that offered no comfort. The temperature plummeted, and the desert which had tried to cook her alive now tried to freeze her. She huddled behind a cluster of boulders, shivering, listening to the yips and howls of coyotes. They sounded unnervingly close. She ate the single piece of hardtack, the dry crumbs scraping her throat. Sleep came only in short, fitful bursts, filled with nightmares of Silas Cain's cold eyes and the leering faces of the townsfolk. The second day was a waking nightmare. The canteen was empty by noon. Her lips cracked and bled. Her tongue felt thick and swollen in her mouth. The world began to swim in and out of focus. The distant mountains, her supposed destination, seemed to mock her, never getting any closer. She stumbled, her ankle twisting on a loose rock. Pain shot up her leg, hot and sharp. She lay in the dust for a long time, the sun beating down on her back. This was it. This was the God's judgment Cain had spoken of. It was a slow, agonizing execution by the elements. Tears carved clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. She thought of her father, of his gentle hands and quiet strength, and a wave of profound, soul-crushing loneliness washed over her. She forced herself up. She had to keep moving. She didn't know why, only that to stop was to surrender. She limped onward, her vision blurring her mind, a fog of thirst and pain. The world became a kaleidoscope of harsh light and deep shadow. It was late in the afternoon when she saw it. Not a man, but a sign of one. A single dark feather tied with a strip of sinew to a desiccated branch of mesquite. It felt like a warning. She was in his territory now. The fear which had been a dull ache sharpened into a blade. She pushed on, driven by some primal instinct, until her body could give no more. The landscape began to rise, the flat desert floor, giving way to rocky canyons and hidden arroyos. She stumbled into the shade of a towering rock formation, a narrow canyon that offered a brief respite from the sun. Her legs gave out. She collapsed onto the cool sand, her consciousness fraying at the edges. Her last coherent thought was not of Cain or of justice. It was a simple, heartbreaking regret for a life she never got to live. She didn't know how long she was out. It could have been minutes or hours. She awoke to a shadow falling over her. Her eyes fluttered open, struggling to focus. Standing above her was a man. He was tall and lean, built of sinew and desert-hardened muscle. His skin was the color of copper, his black hair long and unbound, save for a simple leather band across his forehead. He wore buckskin leggings and a breechcloth, his chest and arms bare, crisscrossed with old faded scars. His face was sharp, angular, with high cheekbones and a stern, unsmiling mouth. But it was his eyes that held her. They were dark, piercing, and intelligent. They assessed her not with malice, but with a startling, unnerving intensity. In his hand, he held not a weapon, but a small clay jug. This was him. This had to be Casca, the blood hunter. She had been sent to him to die. Josephine closed her eyes, her body too weak to even tremble, and waited for the end. The killing blow never came. Instead, she felt a gentle pressure at her back. The man was lifting her head, his movements economical and sure. He brought the clay jug to her cracked lips, and the scent of cool, clean water, a scent more precious than any perfume, filled her senses. "Need you," he said. The word was low, guttural, yet soft. Water trickled into her mouth. She drank greedily, at first choking, and he pulled it back, waiting a moment before offering it again. He let her drink in slow, measured sips until the raw fire in her throat was quenched. He was Casca, the monster from the stories, but his hands were surprisingly gentle. He examined her twisted ankle with a practiced touch, his fingers probing the swollen joint with a firm but painless pressure. He then looked at her face, at the sunburn and the grime, and his expression was impossible to read. It was not pity, not anger, not curiosity. It was a deep, profound stillness, like a desert pool at midnight. With an ease that belied her dead weight, he lifted her into his arms. Josephine was too weak to protest her mind, too dazed to process the sheer surreality of it all. The dreaded Apache killer was carrying her as if she were a child. He moved through the winding canyon with a silent fluid. Grace, his moccasined feet, making no sound on the rocky ground. He was not walking on the land. He was a part of it. His home was not a cave or a crude shelter, but a hidden sanctuary. Tucked into a deep recess of the canyon, shielded by a curtain of ancient gnarled cottonwood trees, was a small, well-tended camp. A stream, the one her father's map had shown, trickled nearby, feeding a patch of green where corn and squash grew. A wickiup, a simple dome-shaped dwelling made of branches and hides, stood in the center. It was a place of profound peace, a world away from the howling desolation she had just traversed. He laid her down gently on a soft pile of furs inside the wickiup. The air inside was cool and smelled of earth herbs and wood smoke. He left her for a moment and returned with a wooden bowl containing a mash of crushed leaves. He applied the poultice to her ankle, and a soothing coolness spread through her skin, easing the throbbing pain. For the next few days, Josephine drifted in and out of a feverish sleep. Her life was a blur of sensations. The taste of a thin, savory broth he spooned into her mouth, the feel of a cool, damp cloth on her forehead, the low, rhythmic sound of his voice as he chanted softly in his own language, a sound that strangely did not frighten her. When her fever finally broke, she woke to find him sitting cross-legged by the small fire pit just outside the wickiup, mending a piece of leather. The sun was setting, painting the canyon walls in fiery shades of orange and purple. He looked up and saw she was awake. He nodded once, a simple acknowledgement, and went back to his work. There was no warmth between them, but there was also no threat. There was only a quiet, watchful space. He was a man of few movements and fewer words. He gave her food, roasted rabbit ground, cornmeal cakes, sweet-baked squash. He gave her fresh water from the stream. He tended to her ankle daily. He gave her the safety of his sanctuary. He never asked her name or where she came from. He never spoke English. Communication began with gestures, a nod for yes, a shake of the head for no. He would point to the water and say tu. He would point to the fire and say ko. She was a quick learner, and she would repeat the words. Her name, Josephine, was too complex. One day, watching her mend a tear in her dress with a needle and thread he had given her salvaged, she presumed from some raid or trade. Long ago he pointed at her and said a word, Atza, needle. It became her name in this silent world they shared. She learned his name was not Casque. That was a white man's name, for him a corruption of an Apache word meaning to cut. His real name, which he told her by pointing to his chest, was Nakoda. It meant ally or friend. The irony was so bitter it almost made her laugh. The world saw him as a bloodthirsty killer, a monster. But here in his solitude, he was a healer, a protector, a man who showed more humanity in his silence than the entire town of Redemption Bluff had shown with all their pious words. One evening, as she sat watching him carve a piece of wood, the memories of her condemnation came rushing back, fresh and raw. The faces, the injustice, the sheer crushing helplessness. A sob escaped her lips before she could stifle it. Nakoda stopped his carving. He looked at her, his dark eyes unblinking. He didn't move to comfort her, didn't offer any empty platitudes. He simply sat and watched, bearing witness to her grief. In his stillness there was a strange kind of comfort. It was as if he understood that some wounds were too deep for words and could only be healed by being allowed to bleed. In that moment, Josephine Bell understood she was not his prisoner. She was his guest, and for the first time since her father's death, she did not feel entirely alone. Weeks turned into a month. The fierce heat of summer began to yield to the crisper air of autumn. Josephine's ankle healed, leaving only a slight ache when the air grew cold. Her sunburnt skin peeled and was replaced by a healthy tanned glow. She grew stronger, helping Nakoda tend his small garden, gather herbs, and check his snares. She learned the language of the canyon. The call of a hawk meant a rabbit was near. The rustle of leaves in a certain way warned of a snake. She learned silence, not as an absence of sound, but as a state of being, a way of listening to the world around her. Nakoda remained an enigma. He was a man of profound discipline and ritual. He greeted the dawn each day with a silent meditation, facing the rising sun. He moved with a purpose and economy that wasted nothing, not a motion, not a resource, not a word. He was a hunter, yes. She saw the lethal grace with which he could draw his bow, the unerring accuracy of his arrow. But he was also a caretaker. He never took more from the land than he needed, and he treated the animals he hunted with a kind of solemn respect that she had never witnessed before. The ledger which she had managed to keep tucked into the bodice of her dress during her ordeal was a constant, heavy weight against her skin. It was the reason for her exile, the proof of Cain's evil. One evening, emboldened by the tentative trust that had grown between them, she decided to show it to him. They sat by the fire, the flames casting dancing shadows on the canyon walls. With trembling hands, she pulled out the worn leather book. She opened it, its pages filled with her father's neat, precise script. She didn't know how to explain land deeds or fraudulent claims in the few Apache words she knew, so she simply pointed. She pointed at Silas Cain's name, which appeared on nearly every page, and made a snake-like motion with her hand, hissing softly. It was a childish gesture, but it was all she had. Nakoda took the ledger from her. He handled it with care, a surprising reverence for a white man's book. He did not look at the numbers or the writing. His eyes, sharp and focused, were drawn to one thing, a small embossed symbol on the inside cover. It was the brand of the Bar K Ranch, a letter K set inside a broken circle. A change came over him. The calm stillness that always surrounded him was shattered. His jaw tightened, and a muscle twitched in his cheek. His eyes, usually so placid now, burned with a cold, ancient fire. He traced the symbol with his finger, and a single guttural word escaped his lips, a word that sounded like a curse. "Bie lichioi," he whispered. The red sleeves. It was what his people had called the U.S. soldiers, but the word held more venom than a simple description. It was a name for a specific kind of butcher. He stood up and walked to the back of the wickiup. He returned with a small bundle of deer hide tied with sinew. He unrolled it carefully on the ground between them. Inside were a few precious items, a string of turquoise beads, a flint and steel, and a single tarnished silver locket. He opened the locket. On one side was a faded miniature portrait of a young Apache woman with smiling eyes. On the other was a tiny pressed desert marigold. Then, using the burnt tip of a stick to draw in the sand, he began to tell her his story. It was a story told not with words, but with images, gestures, and a pain that transcended language. He drew a canyon much like this one, but larger. He drew many wickiups of village. He drew women, children, and old ones. This was his family, his people. He drew a picture of himself younger, alongside the woman from the locket, his wife. He drew a small stick figure beside them, his son. Then he drew new figures, men on horses. He drew rifles. On the flank of one of the horses, he drew the symbol from the ledger, the Bar K brand. He swept his hand over the drawing of the village, wiping it away in a gesture of violent finality. He drew fire. He drew bodies. He drew one man, a man with a beard, standing over the chaos, a long cavalry saber in his hand. He looked at Josephine, his eyes filled with a grief so profound it was like a physical wound. He then drew himself alone, hiding in the rocks, watching. He was just a young man then, away on a solitary hunt when the raid happened. It wasn't a battle. It was a massacre, led not by soldiers in blue, but by ranchers and prospectors, a vigilante mob deputized to clear the territory. They were led by a man who wanted the water in that canyon for his cattle, a man who used a rumor of a stolen cow as a pretext for genocide. His name was Jedediah Cain, Silas Cain's father. Nakoda had survived, and he had hunted. He had spent the next 2 years tracking down the men from that raid, the ones he could identify. This was how he had earned the name Blood Hunter. It was not a title of pride, but a monument to his pain. When his vengeance was complete, he had retreated here to this solitary canyon, to live out his days, an outcast, by choice, haunted by the ghosts of his past. Josephine stared at the drawings in the sand, then at the ledger in her lap. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. This wasn't just about a spring on the O'Malley's land. The ledger was a record of the Cain family's entire empire, built block by bloody block on stolen land, legitimized with fraudulent paperwork. Her father hadn't just uncovered a single crime. He had stumbled upon the foundational sin of Redemption Bluff. And Silas Cain was not just a greedy rancher. He was the son of a mass murderer, protecting a legacy of blood and lies. She looked at Nakoda at the stoic mask that had once again fallen over his features, hiding the lifetime of pain beneath. They were not so different, she realized. Both of them were survivors of Silas Cain's world. Both of them were ghosts, haunted by the injustice that had been done to them and their families. The unspoken truth now lay between them, stark and terrible in the firelight. This was no longer just her fight. It was his, too. Back in Redemption, Bluff Silas Cain was growing impatient. Weeks had passed, and the desert had remained silent. No prospector had stumbled upon Josephine Bell's sun-bleached bones. No traveler had brought back tales of a woman's ghost haunting the badlands. This lack of news was a loose thread, and Cain hated loose threads. They had a tendency to unravel the carefully woven fabric of his power. He stood on the porch of his sprawling ranch house, staring east toward the jagged peaks of the Dragoon Mountains. The ledger she carried was a cancer. It wasn't just about the O'Malley Spring. It was a testament to a dozen other acquisitions just as ruthless. If that book ever found its way into the hands of a territorial marshal with a spine, his empire could crumble. "She's dead," Sheriff Brody insisted, wiping sweat from his brow. "Nothing can survive out there. Nothing but him. And that's what worries me, Brody." Cain said, his voice low and dangerous. "He is a loose end. Always has been. My father should have finished the job years ago." He took a long drag from his cigar, the tip glowing like a malevolent eye in the twilight. "I want confirmation. I want her body or the book. Preferably both." "Who'd be fool enough to go into Cascay's territory looking for a fight?" the sheriff asked, his unease palpable. Cain smiled a chilling, humorless expression. "I have just the man." His name was Jebediah Stone. He was not a ranch hand or a hired gun in the usual sense. He was Cain's wolf, a gaunt, leather-tough man with pale, dead eyes and a face that looked like it had been carved from petrified wood. Stone was a tracker, renowned and feared throughout the territory. They said he could track a whisper on the wind. He had served as a scout for the army during the Apache Wars and had learned their ways, turning their own skills against them. He hunted men for money, but he hunted Apaches for pleasure. Cain offered Stone a sum that made even the cold-eyed tracker blink. "Find the girl," Cain instructed. "If the Apache has her, kill them both. Burn whatever shelter you find. Erase them, and bring me that ledger." Stone simply nodded, collected his pay, and rode out the next morning, leading a small posse of Cain's most ruthless men. He also insisted on taking along one of the town's deputies, a young, impressionable man named Miller. Cain agreed. Having a legitimate lawman present would make the whole affair look official if questions were ever asked. Deputy Miller, eager to prove his worth and too naive to understand the true nature of his mission, went along without protest. In the canyon, a sense of unease had begun to creep into the peaceful rhythm of life. Nakoda had grown watchful, his senses on a knife's edge. One morning he returned from a high ridge, his face grim. He didn't need to use words. He drew a quick sketch in the dirt, 5 men on horseback, one of them leading the others following a trail. Her trail. Josephine's blood ran cold. They had come for her. Cain hadn't been satisfied with leaving her to the desert. He needed to be certain. "They will not find this place," Nakoda said, speaking one of the few complete English sentences she had ever heard from him. His voice was a low rumble. The canyon guards its secrets. But there was a new tension in his eyes. He knew who Cain would send. There were few white men who could read the land as he could, but he knew of one. Adawizzi, the man who stalks, Jebediah Stone. The hunter was now the hunted. Nakoda began to prepare. He was no longer the quiet caretaker of his sanctuary. A different man emerged, the warrior from the stories, the survivor of the massacre. His movements became sharper, more deliberate. He checked the tension on his bowstring. He carefully selected arrows, testing their fletching and their points. He gathered supplies, dried meat, a water skin, the small deerskin bundle containing his past. "We leave," he stated simply, pointing not away from the riders, but deeper into the labyrinthine maze of the Dragoon Mountains. "We let the mountain be the hunter." Josephine, who weeks ago would have been paralyzed by fear, found a new resolve hardening within her. She was not the same woman who had been cast out of Redemption Bluff. The desert had stripped her of her old fears and replaced them with a quiet strength. She would not be a liability. She packed what little she had, her heart pounding a steady, determined rhythm against her ribs. She was no longer just a victim. She was a survivor. And she would fight in her own way to stay that way. As they abandoned the small hidden camp that had been her salvation, taking one last look at the garden and the wickiup, she knew that their peaceful interlude was over. The violence of Silas Cain's world had found them, and now their only sanctuary was the chase itself. The chase was a brutal education in the art of invisibility. Jebediah Stone was as good as his reputation, a relentless and cunning pursuer. He followed the trail Josephine had left days earlier with unnerving precision. But Nakoda was not following a trail. He was reading a story Stone could not comprehend. He was reading the wind, the flight of birds, the subtle shifts in the landscape that were invisible to any other eye. They moved through the mountains like ghosts. Nakoda led Josephine through paths that weren't paths, across sheer rock faces that seemed impassable, and through narrow slot canyons where the walls were so close they could touch both sides at once. He taught her how to walk on rock to leave no print, how to brush away her tracks in the sand with a leafy branch, how to use the sun and shadows as a cloak. Her body, hardened by weeks of canyon life, responded. She learned to climb, to endure, to be silent for hours on end. The fear was still there, a cold companion in the pit of her stomach, but it was now a tool. It kept her alert, her senses sharp. Days blurred into a series of tense, whispered movements and long, watchful nights. From high ledges, they would watch Stone and his posse, far below the men, looking like angry ants crawling through the vastness. They were close, dangerously close. One afternoon they were cornered. They had taken refuge in a shallow cave on a cliffside when Stone's party made camp directly below them. They were trapped. A single dislodged pebble would mean discovery and death. They lay motionless on the cold stone for an entire night, and most of the next day, listening to the gruff voices of the men below. It was then that Josephine saw the conflict within the posse. Deputy Miller, the young lawman, was clearly uncomfortable. While Stone and the others spoke of killing the savage and retrieving Cain's property, Miller was quiet and withdrawn. He tended the horses, his face a mask of doubt. He had signed up to uphold the law, not to be part of a rich man's private death squad. Jebediah Stone, however, was in his element. "He's here!" Stone rasped to his men, his voice carrying up to their hiding spot on the still air. "I can smell him. He's playing with us. Thinks the mountain will protect him. But this mountain belongs to me now." As the sun began to set on the second day, Nakoda knew they couldn't wait any longer. They would be discovered with the morning light. He gestured for Josephine to stay put. Then, with the silence of a falling shadow, he slipped out of the cave. Josephine held her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs. Minutes stretched into an eternity. She heard a faint noise from the camp below, a horse whinnying nervously. Then another. Then a sudden shout of alarm. From her vantage point, she saw the posse's horses, which had been tethered together, suddenly break free and scatter in every direction, spooked by something she couldn't see. In the ensuing chaos, with men cursing and running to retrieve their mounts, Nakoda slipped back into the cave beside her, his breathing, even his expression, unreadable. He had created the perfect diversion, without firing a single arrow, without shedding a single drop of blood. They used the confusion and the darkness to make their escape moving swiftly along the ridge. But the incident had a profound effect on Deputy Miller. He had seen something in the twilight, a flicker of movement, too graceful and deliberate to be an animal. He realized they weren't just hunting a person. They were hunting something that was part of the very fabric of this land, and he saw the obsessive, inhuman glint in Stone's eyes. This wasn't justice. It was a vendetta. The next day, as the posse tried to round up their scattered horses, Miller made a decision. While retrieving a stray mare in a thicket of manzanita, far from the eyes of the others, he found a clear moccasin print in the dirt. It pointed west away from their current direction. He knew it was fresh. He looked in the direction the print was heading, then back toward Stone. With his boot, he deliberately scuffed the print, erasing it from the earth. It was a small act of rebellion, a quiet shift of allegiance, but in the deadly chess match being played in the canyons, it was a move that would change everything. Unaware of their new, unseen ally, Nakoda and Josephine continued their flight. But Nakoda knew that running was not a permanent solution. Stone was too good. He would not give up. They could not outrun him forever. The mountain could be a shield, but it could also be a tomb. The fight, he realized, could not be won here. It had to be taken back to the source of the poison. It had to be taken back to Redemption Bluff. The decision to return was a terrifying one. For Josephine, Redemption Bluff was the site of her humiliation and condemnation. To go back felt like walking willingly into a lion's den. For Nakoda, any white settlement was enemy territory, a place of hatred and broken promises. But they both knew it was the only way. To expose a rot, you have to cut it open at its source. They changed direction, heading north, circling around the mountains, on a long, arduous journey toward the high desert plateau where Redemption Bluff was situated. Their goal was no longer evasion, but a calculated infiltration. They needed an ally, someone inside the world they sought to challenge. Nakoda knew of one man, a man who lived on the fringes, despised by the town, but tolerated for his skills. His name was Phineas Cobb. He was an old, grizzled prospector who had been working the claims in the Dragoons for 20 years. He was eccentric, cantankerous, and fiercely independent. More importantly, he hated Silas Cain with a singular passion. Cain had cheated him out of a lucrative silver claim years ago through a tangle of legal documents and intimidation, leaving Phineas with nothing but a worthless patch of rock and a simmering grudge. They found his camp tucked into a remote arroyo, a chaotic collection of tense tools and pack mules. Phineas, a wiry man with a wild beard and eyes the color of faded denim, greeted them with a shotgun leveled at their chests. "Far enough," he rasped, spitting a stream of tobacco juice. Nakoda raised an open hand, a sign of peace. He called out the prospector's name. Phineas squinted, lowering the shotgun slightly. "I'll be damned. The mountain ghost himself. Heard you were dead. Heard it a dozen times." His eyes shifted to Josephine. "And who's this? You're supposed to be coyote food." Josephine stepped forward. "Mr. Cobb, my name is Josephine Bell. Silas Cain sent me into the desert to die. This man saved my life. We need your help." Phineas grunted, studying them both. He saw the desperation, but he also saw the resolve. He saw the ledger tucked under Josephine's arm. "Cain," he muttered the name, a curse on his tongue. "Anything that puts a burr under that bastard's saddle is fine by me. Come on in. Don't mind the mess." Inside his dusty, cluttered tent, they laid out the story. Josephine explained the ledger, her father's discovery, and the O'Malley's fate. Nakoda, speaking in his terse but effective English, told of the massacre led by Jedediah Cain, connecting the family's legacy of greed directly to the Bar K brand in the book. Phineas listened, his expression growing darker with every word. He traced the lines on the old map inside the ledger with a grimy finger. "I knew it," he whispered. "I knew old man O'Malley wouldn't just up and leave that spring. That water's worth more than gold out here." He looked at the ledger, then at them. "So you aim to just walk into town and call him out. He'll have you shot before you can say boo." "We need to get the truth to the people," Josephine insisted. "Not just the people Cain owns, but the ordinary folk, the freighters, the farmers. They have to see what he is." An idea began to form. Phineas knew that the following week, a territorial judge, Judge Beaumont, was scheduled to make his semi-annual visit to Redemption Bluff. It was a major event. Cain always hosted a big town luncheon in the plaza, making a grand show of his civic leadership and generosity. It would be the one time the entire town, along with an official legal authority, was gathered in one place. It was their only chance. Their plan was audacious. Phineas would go into town and spread the word that he'd finally struck silver, a massive vein. He'd offer to buy drinks for everyone at the saloon, creating a buzz and ensuring a large, boisterous crowd for the judge's arrival. It would also serve as a distraction. Meanwhile, a new, unexpected ally made his move. Deputy Miller, having led Stone's posse on a 3-day wild goose chase based on his misreading of the trail, finally declared the tracks cold and the search a failure. He rode back to town with a frustrated and suspicious Jebediah Stone. That night, haunted by his conscience, Miller sought out the one person in town he thought he could trust, Martha, the quiet, stern woman who ran the boarding house and had been a friend to Josephine's father. He confessed his doubts, his voice barely a whisper. Martha, who had always suspected foul play in Thomas Bell's death, listened intently. The next day, under the guise of buying supplies, Miller rode a few miles out of town. Phineas, having been tipped off by Martha, was waiting for him. The meeting was tense, a lawman and a wanted woman's conspirator, but Miller's resolve was firm. "I took an oath," Miller said, his young face set with determination. "And it wasn't to Silas Cain. It was to the law. What do you need?" The final pieces of the plan fell into place. Miller would ensure the sheriff and Cain's men were occupied during the luncheon. Phineas would stir up the crowd, and Josephine, disguised as a timid niece of the prospector, would walk into the heart of the town that had condemned her. Nakoda would be their shadow, their protector, positioned on a rooftop overlooking the plaza, his bow ready. He was the ghost, and he would ensure their plan did not fail. It was a desperate gamble, a single roll of the dice against a man who owned the entire table. But as they finalized their strategy, a fragile hope began to burn brighter than their fear. It was the hope that in the Wild West, even in a town called Redemption, the truth, if armed with enough courage, could be the most powerful weapon of all. The day of Judge Beaumont's arrival dawned bright and clear. Redemption Bluff was buzzing with an almost festive energy. Phineas Cobb had played his part to perfection. Rumors of his silver strike were on everyone's lips, and the saloon had been overflowing since the night before. The promise of a free meal from Silas Cain and the spectacle of the judge's visit had drawn everyone into the central plaza. Josephine stood at the edge of town, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She wore a plain, borrowed dress and a wide-brimmed bonnet that shadowed her face. Beside her, Phineas gave her a reassuring nod. "Just a scared little church mouse, remember," he whispered. "No one will look at you twice." They walked into the plaza, melting into the crowd. Josephine kept her head down her eyes, scanning the scene. She saw Silas Cain, preening in a fine suit, laughing with Judge Beaumont, a portly, important-looking man with a gold watch chain stretched across his vest. She saw Sheriff Brody looking flustered and important directing traffic, and she saw Jebediah Stone leaning against a post of the general store, his pale eyes sweeping the crowd, ever watchful. He was Cain's insurance policy. From the corner of her eye, she glanced up at the flat roof of the livery stable. A shadow moved for a split second, then was still. Nakoda was in position. The luncheon began. Cain took the makeshift stage, a beaming portrait of civic virtue. "Welcome, Judge Beaumont. Welcome, friends and neighbors," he began, his voice booming across the plaza. "It is on days like this that we are reminded of the prosperity and order we have built here together, under the watchful eye of the law." This was their cue. "The law!" A voice roared from the crowd. It was Phineas, stepping forward, his face flushed with righteous anger. "What law is that, Cain? The one that lets you steal a man's land and his water?" A hush fell over the plaza. Cain's smile faltered. "Phineas, you've had too much of your own celebratory whiskey. Don't make a fool of yourself in front of the judge." "The only fool here is anyone who still believes your lies," Phineas retorted. At that moment, Deputy Miller, as planned, shouted from the far end of the street, "Sheriff, there's a brawl at the saloon. 2 freighters going at it with axe handles." Sheriff Brody, grateful for any excuse to escape the confrontation, immediately grabbed his other 2 deputies. "I'll handle it," he yelled and scurried off. Now Cain was alone with his wolf. He signaled to Jebediah Stone, but before Stone could move, Josephine stepped out from behind Phineas, pulling off her bonnet. A collective gasp went through the crowd. "It's the Bell Girl!" someone shouted. "She's alive!" Josephine walked toward the stage, her steps steady, her gaze locked on Silas Cain. His face paled, his composure shattering. This was not possible. She was supposed to be bones and dust. "You're right, Mr. Cain," Josephine said, her voice clear and strong, carrying across the silent plaza. "We have built something here. Your family built an empire, and this book," she held up the leather ledger, "is the story of how you built it." She opened the ledger. "It's all in here. The O'Malley's spring, which you stole after they disappeared. The Cobb silver claim falsified on your deeds. A dozen other families pushed out, bought out for pennies or simply erased. All recorded in my father's hand, the man you had poisoned because he learned the truth. Lies, slander." Cain sputtered his face, turning a blotchy red. "This woman is a wanted criminal. A fraud. Jebediah, arrest her." Stone started forward, his hand dropping to the butt of his pistol. But then another figure appeared, seemingly from nowhere. Nakoda dropped silently from the rooftop, into the alley behind the stage, stepping out into the sunlight. He was not armed with his bow, but he held the tarnished silver locket in his hand. The crowd shrank back. The blood hunter of their nightmares was here in the heart of their town. He was not a monster. He was just a man. His face, a mask of solemn grief and iron will. Nakoda walked to the stage, his eyes never leaving Cain. "Your father, Jedediah Cain." Nakoda said, his English clear and laced with the ice of old hatreds, "led the men who murdered my family, my wife, my son." He held up the locket. "He did this for the water in our canyon, so his cattle could drink. He signed his crime with his brand." He pointed a finger at Cain. "The same brand in that book. The brand that built this town on the graves of my people." The truth, raw and undeniable, hung in the air. The ledger in Josephine's hand and the testimony of the man they had feared for so long came together in a perfect, horrifying picture. The townspeople looked at Cain not with fear or loyalty anymore, but with dawning comprehension and revulsion. Judge Beaumont, his face grim, stepped forward. "Mr. Cain," he said, his voice cold, "these are the most serious allegations I have ever heard. You will hand over that ledger, young lady, and you, sir, will be placed under arrest pending a full investigation by the territorial marshal." Cain was cornered. His power, built on illusion and fear, had evaporated in the sunlight. In a final desperate act, he screamed, "Kill them, Stone, kill them all!" Jebediah Stone drew his gun, but before he could aim, a voice rang out, "No!" Deputy Miller stood between Stone and the stage, his own pistol drawn and steady. "It's over, Stone. The law is here now. The real law." For a moment, the two men faced each other. Stone's dead eyes showed a flicker of surprise, then contempt. He decided Miller was the easier target. But as he began to turn his pistol, the air hissed. An arrow, black-fletched and deadly, flew from the roof of the general store and buried itself deep in Stone's gun hand. He screamed, dropping the pistol, as blood gushed from his ruined wrist. Phineas Cobb had provided Nakoda with a second bow. It was over. The crowd surged forward, no longer afraid. They surrounded Cain, their faces hard with betrayal. Deputy Miller formally arrested him, his voice ringing with newfound authority. The reckoning had come to Redemption Bluff. In the aftermath, the truth did what bullets never could. It cleansed the town. Judge Beaumont's investigation, guided by the meticulous records in Thomas Bell's ledger, dismantled Silas Cain's empire of deceit, piece by piece. Cain was sentenced to life in the territorial prison at Yuma, a fate many considered worse than hanging. The stolen lands were, where possible, returned to their rightful owners or opened for new, honest settlement. Redemption Bluff began a slow, painful process of truly living up to its name. Deputy Miller became Sheriff Miller, a man respected for his courage and integrity. Phineas Cobb, celebrated as a hero, finally got his silver claim back, though he claimed his greatest treasure was seeing the look on Cain's face. Josephine Bell did not stay. She had cleared her father's name and brought his killer to justice, but the town held too many ghosts. Before she left, she went to the edge of the desert. Nakoda was there, waiting, a silent figure against the setting sun. There were no grand farewells. Words were inadequate for what they had shared. He simply handed her the silver locket, a keepsake, a reminder. She nodded, a promise of remembrance passing between them. He turned and walked back into the mountains, the ghost returning to his sanctuary, his long war finally over. If this story of survival and the unlikely alliance that brought down a tyrant resonated with you, please consider giving this video a like and sharing it with someone who appreciates a true tale of the Old West. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of justice, courage, and the hidden heroes of the American frontier. Thank you for listening.